We're going to look at imperialism in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. So imperialism would spread the economic, political, and social philosophies of Europe and the United States throughout the world. So again, what imperialism is all about, it's just like when we did exploration, we're exporting European and now even American culture, and we're not only going to keep it in Europe and the United States, but of course it transfers to the colonies. So now we're going to spread it even more throughout the world, okay? And that's what imperialism is all about. So to begin with, we're going to look at Africa. So European domination would expand beyond West Africa. So remember that when Europeans started to go exploring, right, and when we first encountered Africa, Europeans were setting up trading posts along the western coast of Africa, right, mainly for slavery, okay, for the slave trade. But now what we're going to see is that beginning with things like the Suez Canal, Europeans are going to go beyond Africa, okay, beyond, the west coast. So with the Suez Canal, what happens is, then this is where the Suez Canal is, so what happens is, originally it was built by the French. Now, a French company started building it, but basically it got too expensive, so they had to stop. And so the British would take it over, and a British company would finish with the building the Suez Canal. Now, the main thing you need to know for the Suez Canal, the most important thing is that the Suez Canal was a lifeline to British India. Okay, so here's London, okay, England on the map. And so in order to get over to India, a major colony for Britain, to get cotton, to get tea, okay, things like that. In order to get to India, and of course even over to China, but we're going to mainly, it's India at the moment. So to get to India, right, we have to go all the way down around the continent of Africa, all the way back up and over to India. Now, that's a really long route. So what happens is, with Britain taking over the Suez Canal, now it provides a shortcut, basically. And so now we can go down by Portugal, cut through the Mediterranean, okay, go through the Suez Canal, right, because it's basically land right through here, but with the canal they basically dig a trench and they allow the water to come in, and the boats go through the canal. And so now they're able to go through the Red Sea, out by the Gulf of Aden, and over to India, right? So that cuts your trip into a very, very small trip, right? We have 12,300 miles. So it's over 12,000 miles to go all the way around Africa. But now, it's not quite half, but now we got it down to 7,200 miles, okay? And so what that means in terms of economics is that in order to use this, since they're using the Suez Canal, basically it makes it cheaper to get to India because that's less coal that you would have to burn to get your ship to India, right? Because remember, we're using steam-powered ships. And so it makes it cheaper because you don't have to spend as much money to buy coal and things like that to power your ship to go all the way around Africa. It's a shortcut. Anytime you can get a shortcut, right, it's going to save you money. And so that's why the Suez Canal was important, and it became a lifeline to British India. It's cheaper to go through the canal than it is to go all the way around Africa. You're saving time, which means now we can get more product back and forth between India and England. Now, Britain would take over Egypt and other parts of Africa, and you'll color a map that will look at that. And then Belgium would take over Central Africa, what we had looked at as the Congo before the Congo civilization. Belgium would come down into what is the Congo, and they called it Belgian Congo, and this is part of Belgian Congo. And so essentially the Belgians would go there and they would export their culture, and so the Congo became a very important colony for Belgium. They got things like rubber from there, was one of the main goods that was exported. Other European countries would soon follow. So Britain took over Egypt and other parts of northern Africa. Belgium took over Central Africa, beginning with Belgian Congo, and soon other European countries would follow. Like the French would take over parts of northwest Africa, right? The Germans would come in somewhat. The Portuguese would come down, okay? And the Dutch were already in places like South Africa. Okay, and so what we're going to see is Europeans are going to start to carve up Africa. So one of the results of imperialism, one of the main things, is that European conflicts would carry over to the colonies. So basically think of like the 7 Years' War, right, was fought in Europe, it was fought in India, it was fought here in the United States, right, we call it the French and Indian War. Well, the same thing happens here by the 19th century. European conflicts in the 19th century, the 1800s, like the Napoleonic Wars, would spill over into the colonies, because if you are fighting your enemy, right, you can go to their colonies. If you take over their colonies, that's going to weaken them because that's less goods that they can get, which means their economy is going to suffer, which means they're not as powerful. And so European conflicts like the Napoleonic Wars would be fought in Africa. Britain would take their army and they would fight in Africa, mainly South Africa, right? And so if we look at our map, this is kind of what would become as a result of these conflicts, right? The Dutch were already here in South Africa, but what happens is the Brits come in, and because of the Napoleonic Wars and other wars, the British would take over South Africa and force the Dutch to give up their land. And then they would basically put the Dutch, allow them only to have certain parts of what is South Africa today, like up in there. Okay, and so European conflicts would carry into the colonies. And so these are the Boer Wars that we were talking about. The British would kick the Dutch out. The Dutch were called Boers because that's like the Dutch name for it. And basically they were farmers. The Brits came in and kicked them out. And so now Britain would take over most of South Africa. And even to this day, South Africa is very British. Okay, they speak English among other things, and their culture is kind of a mixture. There's Dutch influences, but there's also British influences as well. Now, one of the reasons that the colonies were there was also keeping in mind, same thing like we did with exploration, one thing that happens with colonies is that as they encountered these people, these uncivilized, quote-unquote, people, what happens is the Europeans begin to send missionaries over to the colonies, places in Africa, Asia, okay? And so Christian missionary efforts were going on. They would basically try to convert the natives into the new religion, into Christian religions, okay? Basically making them give up their traditional ways and, you know, joining Christianity and doing things the Christian way, the European way. And in this here is a picture of a cover of a very famous book that was written by Chinua Achebe, and he writes it. It's called Things Fall Apart, and it basically shows African culture before the European arrival and then after European arrival. And so it kind of shows you what life was like for Africans, and then the missionaries come and start to change things. And so it's a fiction book, but it was a very famous book. I think it won a Nobel Prize, or a laureate, I believe. Okay, so moving to Asia. So the British East India Company's domination of India became a thing. Okay, and so basically they were trading along the coasts, right? We're in still the Mughal Empire, basically, and they were trading along the coast. But what happens is the British East India Company, a private company, would have their own soldiers and their fleets and stuff, and basically they start to take over territory. They start to push into the inwards of India and from the coast. And so the British East India Company would basically make an alliance with local princes and leaders in different areas to get trading rights within that area, okay, beginning in the 1700s. Okay, and so by the 1800s, the British East India Company dominated India. They were pretty much the main ones that had exclusive trading rights. And mainly the main thing, remember, that India is known for is the textile industry. So Indian cotton fueled the textile industry. And so there's a huge boom in the textile industry, a lot of money to be made. And so basically the British East India Company begins to dominate the cotton trade and the textile industry. And of course that helped to fuel the Industrial Revolution, which basically just forms this loop that keeps going. And so the textiles fueled the Industrial Revolution, which created factories, which created more demand, which means we need more cotton, which then created the textile boom, which then led to more industrialization, which led to more cotton being needed, right? And it just keeps going around and around. Europeans in China would create what we call spheres of influence. Now, spheres of influence, basically, it's not like Europeans aren't directly controlling these territories, okay, like they would in places like Africa, like we had here in America, right, way back when. But in the 1800s, Europeans are going to establish spheres of influence. So, like, certain countries established a port city as like their main base of trade in China. So the map over here shows you different colors represent different countries. Okay, and so for instance, Macau, a very important city for trade, was Portuguese. Okay, so Portugal had a sphere of influence at Macau. And so the Portuguese were only allowed to sail into Macau and trade with China and take stuff from Macau back to Portugal, only allowed to go to Macau. The British would eventually get Hong Kong. Okay, they would also get other places. There would be places like Canton, is what the Brits called it, or the Chinese name is Guangzhou. Right? Guangzhou would be a British sphere of influence. But the Russians, of course, up here would come down into northern parts near Manchuria, right, which we'll come back to later. Britain would have a lot of territory right here in like what is Tibet, basically, because they're just over here in India, right? And so a lot of China is going to be carved up by the Europeans. And of course, even in China, you have missionary efforts by the Europeans to convert the Chinese to Christianity. And we'll look at what happens as a result later, basically forcing them to give up their traditional Buddhist ways and traditional way of life and becoming European, becoming white, becoming Christian. Now, America gets involved, not with China initially, but because America sees that Europeans are going and taking over parts in India, they're mainly in China, America is going to get in on the action eventually. America tried to talk to Europeans and negotiate what we called an open door policy, basically to allow for like free trade and no spheres of influence type of thing, but we all just kind of share these ports, share the wealth type of thing, so that America get in on the action. of trade from China, but that didn't work out. Europeans did not agree to that. And so what happens is America, though, does go to Japan to trade. Right now, remember, during the Tokugawa era, which is still up until this point, Japan remains isolated. Now, they did trade with with Asian countries like Korea, China, but for the most part, they were isolated from trade, isolated from the West, especially America, Europe. And so America, though, does sell Admiral Commodore Matthew Perry, actually, which would be depicted here, sails with his gunboat into Japan, and there's this steamship, this huge steamship, gunboat that just sails into the harbor in Japan, and the Japanese are basically forced into opening up trade with America. A lot of it probably had to do with fear, but anyway. So basically, as America opens Japan to trade, that's an end to isolationism for Japan. And so other Europeans come, but there's a lot of influences from the West, American, European culture, end up in Japan. And so Japan is no longer isolated. They're a key player in trade, and so industrialization would come to Japan as well. Now, imperialism would also spread into the Pacific, into Australia, and so Australia became a colony of Britain. Now, what happens is, originally, parts of Australia was going to be used as a penal colony for Britain. In other words, it was a prison. So just like Georgia here in the United States was originally used as a prison, basically work prison for people in the 1600s, what happens in Australia is the same thing. So crime rates are going up in England, and a lot of it had to do with the fact that nobody wanted the poor and the debtors, people who owed money, and the homeless living in the streets of England, and it basically became illegal to do that. And so they go to prison, what's called debtor's prison. So like if you owed money and you couldn't pay your taxes and whatnot, you'd go to prison. Well, the prisons became full in England, so they sent them down to Australia. And so places like New South Wales in Australia became a penal colony. And so it was basically a prison system. Now, the Dutch had already been there, and so some parts of this were already Dutch colonies. Eventually, Britain's going to take it over. And, of course, also New Zealand, which is right here, becomes a British colony. It wasn't a penal colony like Australia was, but it was going to be a colony. Now, Australia provided Britain with resources and other benefits. So originally, part of Australia was a penal colony. Eventually, Britain's going to take over other parts of Australia, and including New Zealand, right? And then, of course, you have the island of Tasmania down here. But what happens is Australia provided natural resources, and this includes New Zealand, natural resources, all kinds of natural resources down there. And also other benefits like ranches, what we call ranches, what they call in Australia, New Zealand as stations, but basically cattle and especially sheep. Okay, sheep stations, or what we would call ranches, basically are a big part of Australian culture and the colonies in Australia and New Zealand. Okay, there's all kinds of resources that Britain is going to gain. Yeah, in the Pacific Islands, this is where America begins to dominate. So European and American domination is going to be a big part of imperialism in the Pacific Islands. Now, the main thing, the motivation, was a desire to control the islands as a way to get to Asia, basically, is like for refueling and supplies. And so America is the main one that's involved in taking over the Pacific Islands. And so if you look at the map, right, here's the United States in red. And so essentially all the little red dots eventually become American protectorates, as we called them. These were areas that were under America's protection, under America's control in the Pacific, right? And of course, we started with Hawaii, and so we would take over the Hawaiian Islands, make them a protectorate. We were taking over places like Midway, Wake Island, Guam, and of course the Philippines, Samoa were important. And so basically, if we're going from the United States here, and the goal is to get to Japan and Asia, right, China, for instance, where a lot of trade is happening that fuels an economy, what happens is we need places to refuel, right? You can only go so long before needing more coal or something along those lines, right? Or some kind of like pit stop to get more supplies or to, take and unload. And so if America, for instance, can control some of these islands, then if we're headed to Japan or China, we can stop, let's say, along Wake Island or somewhere like Guam or Midway, and we can refuel, we can get more supplies. Or if we're coming from China back to the United States, we can control these territories here, and we can put bases, military bases here eventually. We can put ports here that, where industry can grow, and so we can drop off supplies here that other ships can come and take back to the United States. And so it's beneficial to control some of these islands in the Pacific as a way for us to refuel and get supplies more easily. Now, colonial powers wanted to control trade and the production of raw materials in the islands. And so even here in Southeast Asia, as you can see by the colors in the map, it's going to be divided up. So like, for instance, what is now Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos became French Indochina. Burma was British. Okay, that was part of British India eventually. Malay, what is now Malaysia, part of Malaysia, became British. Okay, Indonesia would be controlled. Parts of Indonesia would be the Dutch. Okay, so these are called the Dutch East Indies because there's all kinds of raw materials over here just waiting to be taken back to Europe and then become part of the industrial system, made into other items. Like for instance, Sumatra, the island of Sumatra, the island of Java, coffee comes from here. But there's other minerals and other kinds of resources that come from Southeast Asia that eventually are going to be taken back to Europe. Okay.